Alright, so we're back once again, and today we're going to be discussing two of the biggest changes ever to come to World of Warships. These two changes were and are extremely controversial, and still have and will continue to have a very potent effect on the game and how it's played going forward. So let's get into it. The first change that came into the game and completely changed how the game was played was that of the carrier rework. So let's start with what carriers used to be. Carriers used to be very similar to an RTS style of play, not all that different to what you might expect in games such as StarCraft or even Age of Empires. This method of gameplay, however, was very at odds with the other ship classes in the game, as you had ship classes such as battleships, cruisers and destroyers that had more of a third-person perspective style. This meant that switching between carriers to other classes was a bit of a strange experience. In essence, it was a lot more mechanically challenging to play carriers than that of other ships. Now, that's not to say that carriers were the hardest ship class to play. Mechanical difficulty and actual overall difficulty are very different, but carriers were for sure much more involved than they currently are. If we fast forward to the present day, you can clearly see that the carrier gameplay has become fundamentally changed. It no longer has a real-time strategy aspect to it, and instead is much more in line with the classes in the game, with a very distinct third-person perspective to their gameplay. The rework, however, has led to some very complicated issues with how carriers now interact with other ship classes, and in particular DDs. The way in which carriers allow spotting, easy damage on ships, and are basically untouchable throughout the game has led to lots, and I mean lots, of the community being very angry about how they've been implemented into the game. But only time will tell on how the game will handle the new carriers, and whether or not they'll be a positive benefit long term, or a negative benefit long term, in terms of growth. Okay, so with that in mind, let's move on to perhaps the biggest ever change in World of Warships. This change has had a lot of controversy surrounding it, from when it was first announced, to right now, when it's actually a part of the main game. And that change is the introduction of submarines into World of Warships. First of all, submarines were never meant to be introduced into the game. There was a time when submarines were considered completely out of touch with other classes of ships, much like the carriers were back before their rework. But that has now changed. Recently, submarines were introduced into the main game in the form of submarine battles. This had led to a lot of outrage and from ruined promises of no submarines ever being introduced into the game to the actual gameplay itself, where the absolute burden that is put on the DD players becomes more and more grave. I believe the main complaint when it comes to submarines is the inability of certain ship classes to have any counterplay against them. Take for example battleships. This class of ships doesn't have depth charges, which means that a submerged submarine can sit underwater topping the BB all day with almost no recourse. This is especially potent if it's near the end of the game, when there's few or absolutely no destroyers left on either team, and becomes very unfun to play. Another thing to consider is how submarines interact with smoke. If you're running smoke or a smoke cruiser without depth charges, then the probability of you having a very difficult time in regards to submarines is very high. It effectively means that your smoke is pretty much useless and doesn't matter at all, as you can be permanently spotted by the submarines if they just sit under you. But I think that pretty much covers submarines overall. There's a lot more controversy to go into here, but I think leaving it at that is adequate. But yeah, definitely a lot more that could be said about both submarines and carriers, but that'll just have to wait maybe for another video. So that was two of the biggest changes ever in World of Warships for me. So what do you think? Are these changes what you would have went with? If you liked this video, give it a like. If you didn't, give it a dislike. And if you like this content, consider subscribing. But until next time, I'll see you in the next one.